O.J. Simpson, if you look at all of the evidence, and we don't need to relitigate it, but the People versus O.J. Simpson came on. A lot of you out there are young enough that you don't really remember the O.J. Simpson case because it's been 26 years. I remember exactly where I was when that verdict came down. I was a junior in high school at Martin Luther King High School in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. And I remember everybody reacting in both joy, in disbelief, in anger. There were a lot of different variety of actions and reactions based on O.J. Simpson. And 26 years later, I think most people can look back on it, and I would say there somewhere is around a 90% agreement that O.J. Simpson is responsible for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, that he killed both of them in cold blood, and that he should have been convicted of both of those murders. That it was a failure of the prosecution, that the jury was able to buy into what was really not a substantial amount of reasonable doubt. If you remember that case at all, if the glove fits, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Johnny Cochran was O.J. Simpson's lawyer, and he managed to convince the jury that there was some sort of conspiracy against O.J. Simpson, that there was racism involved in the investigation, and that as a result, O.J. Simpson was not responsible for the murder of either of these people, that somebody else did it, and that he was able to create enough reasonable doubt that someone else was to blame. All of the evidence is pretty clear that O.J. Simpson was the killer here. And all the DNA evidence and everything else that surrounds that case. And if you want to read a fantastic book, Jeffrey Toobin's The People versus O.J. Simpson, I think that's what it's called. Dub, look the title up for that book. They based the FX series that was very popular on the O.J. Simpson case on that book that Jeffrey Toobin wrote, which was basically a behind-the-scenes look. He had access to the judge, Lance Ito, back in that case. Both the defense and the prosecution talked to him behind the scenes, and it is a fabulous book. If you are at all interested in potentially being a lawyer and you want to read an incredible portrait of Los Angeles in that year and in that era surrounding O.J. Simpson, The Run of His Life is the name of this book, The People versus O.J. Simpson. Phenomenal book. We may need to start a book club, by the way. The audience getting big enough at Outkick. I love to read. I'm always trying to read a couple of books at the same time, expand my my universe. The People versus O.J. Simpson. Again, The Run of His Life, The People versus O.J. Simpson. It is an unbelievable story, and I would encourage you to go read that book. But O.J. Simpson, I believe, guilty. And I believe the way that O.J. Simpson was able to avoid responsibility for his guilt was by putting the American judicial system on trial. And the American judicial system, there's no doubt about it, has a history and legacy of racism, particularly in the 1800s and in the first half of the 20th century. And so O.J. Simpson was able to be found not guilty because of the legacy of racism that exists in this country. That was effectively the Johnny Cochran ploy that he was able to create and convince the jury that O.J. Simpson, there was reasonable doubt that he didn't do it, based on not the O.J. case itself, but based on the lingering history of racism in the judicial system. I believe the jury got that case wrong based on all the evidence, all the time that I have spent looking at it. Now, larger context. 26 years later, I believe that the Derek Chauvin case, the George Floyd case, so captivated so many people because of that same racial tension and dynamic that existed in the O.J. Simpson case 26 years ago. O.J. Simpson killed two people, happened to be white, black man gets away with their murder. White police officer Derek Chauvin, George Floyd, black victim of the case, and the case effectively came down to a really difficult standard. And the standard was, what exactly caused George Floyd's death? Did Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd? And when you were in law school, you learn a case that I think is a little bit instructive in terms of this case. You learn a thin-skulled plaintiff case. If you're not familiar with that idea, the idea is that if someone has a thin skull, and some small number of people out there have thin skulls, and what that means is they are more susceptible to being struck in their head and have more severe injuries than a person with a normal skull would. And the court had to grapple in that case with whether or not you should be responsible if you injure someone who happens to have a thin skull, because in a normal situation, a quote-unquote normal person would not have been injured. And the court said, well, you are responsible because of it's a famous case, the thin skull rule. And I thought about that case in the context of the George Floyd and Derek Chauvin case, in that George Floyd was certainly under the influence in some way of drugs. And the question that the defense tried to ask was, what killed George Floyd? Was it the drugs, or was it the behavior of Derek Chauvin? And the prosecution effectively argued the thin skull plaintiff angle, saying, yes, George Floyd may have had extenuating circumstances in his health that put him in danger, but Derek Chauvin's actions, if he had not done what he did, George Floyd would still be alive. And the jury believed that. What I would say that these cases represent over the course of 26 years is, I think the jury was not as influenced by race in the case of Derek Chauvin as they were in the case of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson, I think, got off because of a legacy of racism in our country. I don't think the legacy of racism impacted as much Derek Chauvin in this particular case. What is fascinating to think about is, if I am right, it would reflect that we are actually, even though there's a lot of noise, and even though there is a lot of anger, and even though there is every single day a lot of discord in this country, it would actually reflect that we are moving in a more positive direction over these 26 years as a country, notwithstanding the daily tumult. Because I will tell you this, can you imagine the O.J. Simpson verdict on social media? Can you imagine the reaction to that case today when everyone immediately took to social media to react to it? It's wild to even think about. Just wanted you to put that in the back of your mind. I do think that the conversation I had with Shannon Spake in the first hour led me more to think about it. I talked about this Wednesday afternoon on my afternoon show that I do, and I do think it is utterly intriguing in general. When we come back, we're going to dive back into the NFL draft 1 week from today. Jonathan Hutton, Outkick 360, breaking that down with us and announcing a brand new show that is going to be a part of the Outkick universe. I'm excited for that. I also want you to know, as the occurrence of identity scams continue to increase, more people are looking for ways to protect themselves from cybercriminals. In fact, 60% of Americans believe it's likely that identity theft will cause them a financial loss in the next year. You put your information in so many places online. Unfortunately, cybercriminals around the world keep finding new ways to steal identities. The all-in-one protection of Norton 360 with LifeLock makes it easy to have protection in the digital world. Device security blocks cybercriminals from stealing personal information on your devices. VPN with bank-grade encryption helps keep the personal information you send over Wi-Fi safe. LifeLock Identity Theft Protection monitors your personal information and alerts you to potential threats to your identity. No one can prevent all cybercrime and identity theft or monitor all transactions at all businesses. But if you have Norton 360 with LifeLock, you can opt in to cyber safety. Sign up today and save 20% or more off your first year by going to norton.com/clay. That's 25% off at norton.com/clay. Up next, Jonathan Hutton. We're breaking down the NFL draft. This is Outkick on Fox Sports Radio.